So welcome to another Startup Central Victoria Meetup, and our special guest today is Andrew Hamilton, who's going to talk to us about Pavilla, his latest venture. But first, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the traditional owners, wherever you're tuning in from, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Today is about learning. Our meetups are about sharing the journey, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think that was a film tagline, wasn't it, Andrew? And Andrew has been operating in the regions for a long time. I think I first met you over at Geelong at the Pivot Festival, Andrew. Another story again, we might get onto that later. But most recently, I've been hearing about your new venture, Pavilla. So this is a really good opportunity, one, to tap into your brain as an entrepreneur and the methodology that you've gone about, the process for Pavilla, but also what would be the benefits for people in the region. Obviously, we have a bit of land, a little bit more that's available in the city, and we have some issues at the moment. So this could be of interest to people for many different reasons. So thank you for being our guest this month. What I'd like to ask you to start off with, we've got the name Pavilla, but no one knows what we're talking about. So maybe let's start with a really succinct description. What is Pavilla?
Thank you very much for that, Kerry, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak. And thank you to Startup Central Victoria and everyone watching in on this. It's a really exciting chat to be a part of, yeah, just as exciting. I'm excited about the new Pavilla project that I've been working on for the last year or two. So, in summary, Pavilla is about creating a better outcome for regional short stay accommodation. It does two things. One, it makes it easier for landowners to get involved with short stay accommodation options. And the other is that it creates a brand that gives confidence to tourists who are looking for amazing places to stay, ideally, initially within regional Victoria. It does this by I've created a modular tourism pod that you can put on your land. It's fully off-grid, and that is designed specifically for short stay accommodation. And not only this, the service that I offer is about not just providing the pod and installing it on your property, but it's taking care of the business case development, the planning aspects, which are usually a bit of a hidden surprise for people, and furnishings, and as far as an operating system, booking system for the module. So all encompassing, I call it a plug and stay solution. So, particularly, for example, if you're a winery and you're looking at getting into the accommodation market, it can be a very expensive and confusing and long-winded exercise. So the Pavilla project is about creating a solution where, for what I consider quite a low entry fee, you can have one of these units installed on your property and be trained up, and ready to take accommodation. So you can focus on what you do best, which is running a winery. There are a number of solutions out in the market at the moment, but they primarily focus on just the build of the unit, which often people think is the bulk of the work. It's a significant part, but the key and quite often trickiest and most uncertain component of this is local planning and going through council and getting the approvals. And it's brought many, many projects unstuck before. And with the model that I've developed, which I'll explain a little bit more to you all, it's about creating a bit more certainty and a bit more of a likelihood that this will get through planning.
Okay, so I heard a lot of reference to problems that you've come up with solutions for. What caught your attention in the first place? What sparked the idea? And then what were the problems and how you went about them?
It sparked the idea. I think there is, there's one. The primary problem for me was that I would go and stay in regional Victoria and regional Australia, and I was often underwhelmed by the level and quality of accommodation that I was looking for. It became a very acute during COVID when I'd spend evenings. I've got a background in property development, and I'd spend evenings on the couch looking at vacant blocks of land along riverfronts in regional Victoria for somewhere that I was like, I want to buy a block. I want to go out to nature and I want to feel immersed in nature. Coming out of COVID, I found that the majority of my accommodation options were in the central areas of regional towns, whereas I wanted to be amongst the trees. I wanted to be in a green environment. I wanted to be disconnected from my urban, I'm living up in Melbourne at the moment, so I wanted to be disconnected from that, and I wanted to be next to the fire and looking up at the trees and, by a river or something like that. And I really found it hard to find accommodation that offered that. Now, you've got plenty of Airbnb accommodation, which, housing stock that's being turned into tourism rentals. And we've heard a lot about this and how that's driving an affordability crisis for long-term rentals. There's a lot of that stock, but that stock was never designed to be a short stay, immersed in nature accommodation. It's a 4-bedroom farmhouse that's been leased out, or sometimes you'll have an old, you'll have an old structure that's been renovated, to be turned into some sort of B&B. But what I really felt that a lot of this was unnecessary. Like my partner and I would go and stay in a 3-bedroom farmhouse in a nice location, but we've got all these rooms we don't want to use, and it definitely feels like someone else's house. And ultimately, as we know, that is a house. It should be a house. It should be rented out as a house. Now, I believe there's an opportunity to design something that is designed for regional accommodation. Places I was going to, I'm still stacked on top of other people. It's designed like an urban motel or hotel, and it's like you're still condensed within. Like I went to something on the Mornington Peninsula, which was a beautiful place, but I was overlooking the car park, and I'm walking around and I'm just condensed with other people. So what I call Pavilla, it's almost like a dispersed hotel, where you can put a couple of these on a block separate from each other, but it's enabling an environment where people are connected to the environment. And being fully off grid means that you're also having a very light footprint on the environment, much lighter than building a massive structure, which is usually to the ire of your neighbours. This is a project that's about, I believe, making a better offering for regional tourism, and secondarily, it's like enabling some of those houses that have been turned into Airbnbs to more likely be pushed back onto the long-term rental market, because they're absorbing the demand at the moment. And I've got some figures around that. 42% of accommodation spending in Australia happens in regional areas. Okay, 42%, which is massive. A massive amount. Almost half of the spending on tourism accommodation happens in regional areas. As far as investment in accommodation in Australia, regional areas only get 21% of the investment. So there is a massive discrepancy between what's actually being spent and what's actually being invested in. So there's a huge shortfall. And that presented a big opportunity, and that's the opportunity that I'm trying to make it easier for people to absorb that demand without it necessarily always having to be some, $50 million resort that's got to be plonked somewhere. It's making it, yeah.
So what you described just prior to that was thinking very much as a consumer. you saw a problem and you found a way, from a consumer point of view, what you wanted to experience. And I think you're probably bang on the money with immersing yourself in nature and low carbon footprint, all of those things. So you're just starting to touch now on what are the problems from the property owner or those interested in investing. There's this big discrepancy. So what are the problems you've identified, and how, just running through them, and how you've resolved those problems in this package?
The biggest one is, I mean, there'd be two. Is, I mean, taking from, and not to assume people's knowledge, because there's lots of varying degrees of knowledge here, but what I most commonly hear, particularly from people who aren't in a property development sort of, when I talk to people, I'm like, great, oh, I love one, I'd love to put one here, or buy a piece of property and put it on. But it's like, people don't think about strategic planning. And it's like, the planning is, I've got a project it's 5 years through planning, like it derails the best of projects. And I'm not here to comment on the planning scheme, because it's like, that's not my profession, but it's getting council approval can be a lengthy process, and it can be very expensive, and people don't expect it. They think, okay, great, here's how much it's going to cost. Okay, cool. What do I need to do? I've got a building permit. I've got to get a planning permit, depending on the zoning of your land. And there's lots of different zonings, and there can be, lots of objections to things. And that can take a process. People can take you to VCAT. You've got to get lawyers. Like, it can be a surprising process, and something that can frustrate people, because they're like, I'm just trying to, it's this beautiful piece of land. I've got this opportunity. I'm not trying to ruin the neighborhood, or I'm not trying to do X, Y, or Z. Like, it seems pretty straightforward, but it's not. And that's a largely hidden problem that I think many people will end up just going, I can't, what's the point? It's expensive. If you want to have one unit, it's an expensive exercise. The second one is, well, okay, there's this option there for regional accommodation, but it's how much money am I going to make? Like, is it going to be self-sustaining? How do you do it? Like, an individual who's might have a nice piece of land or an opportunity, you've got to go and create a whole business case and do your research and understand, okay, well, is it going to be worth it? If I'm going to spend this money, how do I set it up? What are the fees? Like, what's my expected return? Like, where do I get a cleaner from? All of these things are unknowns when you're investing money, particularly in an area that you haven't done it before. And we've got so many. The funny thing about Airbnb is it's like really touched on an opportunity. We've got just tens of thousands of people who are becoming accommodation providers overnight. Now, that's not many of those are trained in hospitality and tourism or have gone through that before. So it can be an expensive exercise, not to mention designing it, like finding builders, understanding it's not just planning approvals. You've got to get, what's your water system? What's your power system? What's your, how do you get it onto the site? Do you need a driveway? What type of drive? I could go on, but it's about, I found the exercise is expensive for an individual to do one. And that's where I'm trying to create a model where I absorb and create benefits from economies of scale by enabling many people the ability to do it once. And, the opportunity that you can come back and I can give you a second and third one and a fourth one, and they all kind of connect. And it's, it's sort of building the business for you to plug into.
Very good reasons. And as I travel around Australia, that everyone tells me they've got the worst SHAR and worst planning.
I've heard that a lot. I've never heard anyone tell me that they've got the best.
So they're good people, and we just know that there's process to be followed. And you're right, having the benefit of experience, you get a bit toughened once you've been through the process once. So yeah, I like that. A model economies of scale, really good.
And the thing to jump in, sorry, on that, Kerry, is like by creating a brand with Pavilla that becomes recognised for being able to do this credibly. If
Yeah.
you're a local, like, like you own a piece of land and you go to your council and like, yes, you've got to build those relationships, but they will question, go, well, you've got no experience doing this before. Like, do you know what you're doing? Have you passed this? Have you passed that? And you're totally right. It's like they've got the best intentions sometimes, but sometimes with planning, it's easier to say no than it is to say yes. And so by creating a brand that's well known, and as I'd like to go with into the Bendigo Council and have that conversation and say, like, I would like to find the right places in your area to find homes for, that are going to work with your, talk to the tourism board as well. Where are the right places, and go into planning with that support. Whereas if it was, that you're sort of coming from a background of credibility, that is much harder for an individual, not to dismiss of anyone's individual business or relationships with their local councils, is that I'm trying to sort of make some of those conversations more efficient.
Well, I have to jump in here because I do love my region. There's some beautiful rivers in the Loddon Shire, the Campaspe, the Massive Ranges, Central Gulf. So, but at what stage are you still consider yourself a startup, Andrew? And what have you done so far to validate all this? What's the process you followed? This is the learning part for us.
I mean, it's, like the interesting thing about startup is I just call it a new business. So it's like, yes, it's a new business. And I haven't got a module in the market at the moment. So the background is basically I built the business cases for, my end as a business, on understanding what the cost would be to be able to, sell to a landowner. But I've also built the business cases from the landowner's point of view, is in going, okay, well, what is the outcome for that landowner? Because I'm selling a business, but it's also possible that some people, like, they just want it for themselves. It's up to them. They might not want to rent it out all year round. They might want to rent it out. They might have, their son lives in the city, or and they come back and visit for weekends, or it might be your own weekender. So I built both of those business cases, and just understanding those planning constraints, and sort of map those out, particularly through a lot of the regional land zones. And in the process of just finalising the design to get that final sort of price point at the moment. But the costings are all sort of there, and the reality is that if you were to go and get one of these designed and made up yourself, you can do it from a standing start. Now, I'm in a position where it's essentially like, if I take an order, it could happen very quickly. And I'm talking at the moment with one of the manufacturer partners about doing a display suite. But for the moment, we're sort of discussing whether that's necessary. So at the moment, we haven't created the unit just yet, but everything else is being validated from a business case point of view.
You want to be careful. You might get lots of offers to host.
Would love to. Happy to chat.
I've got a nice little paddock. I could just picture myself trying it for you. Testing it, validating for you.
What I can say, and it's like, and I've been sort of hesitant to provide those final economic benefits, but it's because it's like I've still got to finalise that number, but it's getting to the 2 or 3% sort of tweak. Is that the returns are quite healthy from what and this is for the customer, from what is considered to be a good business model. So to the point that I've gone over it a number of times, and and I'm sort of like, okay, is this right? But there is a big demand, and there are some other operators in the market that will, and people might have heard of them. There's the tiny homes. So this is not a tiny home. The tiny homes are they're caravans, but like
Oh, well,
they're on wheels.
They're mobile.
They're mobile, and so that has there's a planning. I'm going to call it a planning loophole where a mobile home can be placed on a property without and kind of not need the type of planning permit that that a regular permanent structure would need. Now, it's a big booming thing, right? And it's like it's the size of a caravan, but it's made out of wood and made to look like a shack. But for all planning purposes, it's assessed as a caravan, and you're allowed to have a caravan on your property. But there's a bit of, and you might have a bit of this in your shire, is that there's a bit of an outrage is that some people are dumping a lot of these tiny homes on their properties, but it's using an old caravan planning law where you can, and essentially running unauthorised kind of mini hotels off their site. I personally believe, and it's nothing against these businesses, I believe it's a loophole that's causing some problems, and people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on these units, and if that gets changed, that could mean your investments is, I think that's my view. It's questionable, and there's also my understanding is that the specs that these things are designed for are not passing code of what a caravan is. So it's an interesting one.
Topic of discussion at the moment, and it's about addressing a housing shortage and people that are homeless. So it's more. I think your target audience is probably a very different one. This get in touch with nature and quality. So but you have to consider your competitors. Now, I know you've got some slides to show, but if anyone has any specific questions that they'd like to ask, please feel free to pop them in the chat line or put your hand up if there's something specific you want to ask Andrew. Did you want to, before we just go into a little bit more about your entrepreneurial journey, did you want to show something that will perhaps bring your vision to life a bit more, and also tell us what are you wanting from us? Anyone that's interested in this concept, is it a matter of just contact you, or you're going to launch? Have you got an estimated launch date?
I am having discussions with a few landowners at the moment, and I've had some discussions with different tourism boards, and I'll be extending that, and so it's definitely a project that, as I said, I want to finalise this design before fully launching, but it's definitely a project that I know some people's journeys into this, because there's a financing component that I can discuss through as well. I've got to be careful with my words because I'm not a financial advisor, but there's a financial component that also has a bit of a runway and a bit of a lead time, just in any general business investment. So I'm more than happy to and willing and have begun discussions with people who are interested, and there's a number around the state, and very quickly I've been sort of somewhat public with this project for about a month now, and I've had quite a few conversations start, so definitely interested in that. I'm hoping to get this design finalised in the next sort of 6 weeks and get that number finalised, and then launch from there. So that's a bit of background, but it's
we're getting in for all the news then.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I'd love to.
All right, good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to. A lot of the slides that I put together have echo. They're just polished. They're just
Yeah.
polished visuals that explain a lot of what I've covered off at the moment. But
Just stick through a few and show us what your vision is. So we've heard you talk
yes,
about it, and I'm getting a sense
yes,
that it's the services packaged around the actual unit is
yes,
part of this. Yes.
yes. Okay. Well, I'll pop this up now. Let me know if you can see that.
Yep, that looks good.
Okay. Fantastic. So this is a bit of the branding. So the idea behind the name Pavilla is that it's sort of a hybrid of pavilion and villa, and I really find it's not a. I mean, it's. I mean, there's that sort of like that cabin in the woods idea. It's not necessarily a cabin. It's somewhat of a movable uh, unit, and I really wanted to define a new type of building and own that as the brand. Now, initially, it's aimed at commercial landholders, so I'm looking at recreation, wellness, cultural, like agri-tourism is a huge one. And so, if you have the idea with calling it a pavilla, is that I wanted a name that resonated with the idea of accommodation, that it sparks that, and that, like, let's say you've got Kerry's Winery, like what's another name, like the Bendigo Winery, let's call it, that you could have on your website. So Bendigo Winery Pavillas. Now, it's a brand that sits with your existing brand, right, as a commercial operator, instead of it having to need to be explained Bendigo Winery Accommodation, and then the Pavilla, is that you can call it, the brand's called Pavilla, but the unit's called a Pavilla. And so that enables my brand to sit below your brand. And you get that brand value as sort of those brand values speaking to each other, because I believe that if you wrote Bendigo Winery Pavillas, most people would understand that that means accommodation or somewhere to stay. And it's also creating an ownable word. So as I said, the two-step power of that is that it's the cabin, eco cabin designed for nature-based short stay escapes and experiences. But it's not just the unit, it's the power and how the brand process and platform makes it easier than ever for landowners to get involved. So they're the two sort of main ingredients. As I said, this is my view of how I wanted my escapes to regional Victoria and regional Australia to look like during my times in COVID. And as I said, this is quite often been my experience of what the reality is like, is like small windows or antiquated aesthetics, or, essentially driving all of this way to be jammed in with a million other people anyway. So that's sort of what I thought the reality looks like. I'm obviously touching on everything we know about the renting in regional Australia just got harder. Airbnb host numbers soar. So we've all heard this. The Victorian government's about to look into developing an Airbnb levy. Now, interestingly, I've got some contacts within the state government, is that I would be going to government and fighting that these units don't qualify for such a levy, because I don't believe that these units would be contributing towards the housing crisis that a levy would be trying to resolve. Now, that's where a power of a brand like myself can go and fight a battle than easier than each individual landowner who's got something that needs to go and fight that battle. More cost efficient for me to do that. When talking before about that market opportunity, this is regional tourism accommodation spending is $6.2 billion a year in Australia. And that's 42% of the national, which is almost $15 billion. And these are pre-COVID numbers. I believe this year they're just surpassing that again. And if you look at the investment at $2.3 billion, 21% of national, a huge difference. If you did 42% of the national spending on accommodation investment, should be $4.6 billion. So there's anecdotally a sort of $2 billion shortfall on investment in regional accommodation. And that's a space that I'm very interested in. We've got the rise of eco escapes we've all heard of the glamping that's become very popular, and the tiny homes, obviously I mentioned before, which is the caravans, and you've got modular cabins, and then you've got eco hotels. And the research shows that travellers are willing to pay more for 33% more for ethical tourism, which I think is a big component. However, I believe all of those channels have their issues. And this is just, I've been glamping plenty of times, so I probably say this, and no offense to glamping people, because I'd love to talk to you about getting one of these too. But ultimately, I stay in them, and I feel like it's an expensive tent. And then, as I said, with tiny homes, is that there's questionable planning, and that's not to take away, as you said before, Kerry, about housing affordability and making that easier. I'm all for that, but I understand the government's issues or council's issues with, you can't, like, loopholes in a planning scheme need to be made legitimate, and otherwise, every person it erodes the ability of the system. And I'm not here to comment on the efficiency of that system, but I understand that if they just make an exception, they actually need to change the law, and I'm not against that. I'm just saying that's the situation. Modular cabins, as I said, is a complicated process, and the eco hotel's great if you've got $20 million to spend on one. So that's where I've come up with the Pavilla's affordable luxury accommodation, immersive nature connected to experiences, packaged in an end-to-end scalable offering that makes it easier. I've talked about, though, that the strength of how it works, plugging into a brand, a process, and the platform. And so it's just more than getting a cabin. It's making it easier for landholders with a powerful end-to-end offering. Initially, my focus is on, as I said, commercial landholders. It's of a much sort of stronger viability if you are connected to existing assets like a winery or a distillery or restaurants or farm gates or golf courses, fishing and kayaking or wellness retreats. However, farm diversification is a huge one. So agritourism, as I touched on here, accommodation and food agritourism industry by 2030 is growing to $5.6 billion in Australia. It is it is the second fastest growing section of the food industry in Australia is agritourism. It's growing at, I think, 5% a year or something, just crazy. And it's a huge source of overseas travel, tourism. And, Australia has an amazing international reputation for the quality of food, and people want to be connected to that experience. And, you'll see by the amount of wineries and distilleries, and it's like that experience of food is a huge one. So this is a bit of an overview of where the general nuts and bolts of it sit and some of the aspects that are included in this. So understanding the size of both the rainwater systems and the solar systems that are required. Of course, it comes fully furnished, and it's designed in a way that is designed to appeal to the market. Looking at elements like outdoor fire pits and optional spa and sauna elements, decking, landscaping, and the likes are all designed to fit into the environment, but also, appeal for what is probably a higher end offering. This end-to-end solution, that's what I talked about. You can see here what most people really understand or think the bulk of it is this construction phase, which is this sort of, this darker green element here. But as I said, there's some steps that I offer, which is as far as like a landover interview, a bit of a local market analysis, looking at planning pathways, landing suitability. There's lots of government grant offerings, which I'm in discussions with, and even that is understanding that as an individual from a flat-footed start can be quite a long process. So we'll help try and assess those as well. So then there's the costings, indicative business case, and then a deposit process. Then we go through a planning approvals process, which we would like to be as fast as possible. And I will sort of note on this, as it's like no one can create planning approval certainty. No business would ever sign up to that. So I can't, I'm trying to make it as likely as possible, but there's no guarantee. I can never guarantee planning approval. Then you've got the assembly, which is an offsite. The furniture order, scheduled installation. The great thing with offsite build is that it hits a very predictable timeline, and that's transported to the site and installed with your utilities. And then you have a system set up in marketing. So you'll have some photography done, booking system set up, IoT system for managing the house, and a handover. Now, there are some elements here that, will be flexible as far as people might already have systems in some regards, and so might want to plug their own in at this stage. And that's definitely up for discussion. And then, as I said, it's ready to get up and going with that plug and stay model. And I know from my understanding with finances, like if the project goes well, you can use that money to fund another one. And I'm more than happy to continue to help people on that journey. And that's what I talk about here when understanding how, you can start with one, and if you do a good job of it, you're able to scale up operations whilst lowering your risk. And there are cost efficiencies in doing a couple at the same time, but not I've tried to make it in a way that it's not as large as it would usually be.
Can I jump in here? That previous slide, the one back where you got the process, what sort of time frame? I know you've said no certainty with the planning, but what's a rule of thumb that you hope could be enacted?
The planning, that front section's really got to do with each council, and
we'll take that out of the equation.
Take that out of the equation. You'd be looking at about, I believe it's sort of 10 to 12 weeks for that sort of getting up and running. Once that's, and obviously we'll try and that'll sort of ramp up as more of these go into production, because the benefit from my end with the producer is that if there's a pipeline of these projects, I don't have to wait for approval to get started, that there might be some efficiencies where we can start that. So initially it might be, yes, around 12 weeks, but as more of these hit the market, that timeline should hopefully start to reduce.
All right, now I'll disclose that I have a plumber in the family. I was wondering what system, they're off-grid, land not necessarily connected to sewer systems or anything. Obviously requirements with the Natural Catchment Authority.
Yep.
What systems are you looking at for the septic?
That is a good question. I've had that one a couple of times, and that's something that I have some options that I've started work on. However, with the manufacturer partnership that I'm going through at the moment, the two options that I'm looking at would require two different avenues in that regard. So I have looked at grey water garden systems, but then at the same time, there's certain species of plants that will not tolerate that very much. So I'm trying to make it as minimal as possible, as far as but there is an option which might require pumping every couple of months, as far as having a septic tank and having components of it. We'll try and reuse as much as possible. So particularly if I'm talking to a plumber, I'm probably not in a position where I'd say, okay, it's going to be exactly this. And that's going to come down to, as well, it's the two biggest unknowns that I've got to find that sort of that efficiency for our fire ratings and water systems, because there's a lot of variance in areas and councils as far as what's required there.
And this is just demonstrating to me all the background work and the knowledge and the research that is being undertaken. So once again, the efficiencies, you've already done the work. When you land on a solution, it will be
Yes.
of a long journey.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. And that, yeah, you're right. Yep.
Yeah. Now I'm watching the time.
Yep.
And I am going to show our pre-accelerator participants these slides because it's a wonderful way you've articulated your startup idea, and obviously you're a lot further down the track than ideation, but if you can't articulate it, no one understands what you're talking about. So thank you for showing those.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so you might want to stop sharing now because I
Yep.
want to drill into your entrepreneurial brain just to finish up.
Okay.
This is not your first gig, is it?
No.
How do these ideas come to you? What inspires you to keep putting yourself out there, doing all this research with a bit of risk associated? What's driving you on this journey? What keeps you in the
Um,
game?
I mean, I was sort of, I was raised this way. I come from, I've got, a brother and a couple of sisters, and I remember my parents were always the ridiculous, like they were doing this and publishing companies, and they end up doing property development. And so it's sort of like, you know, um, Dad was quite often like, what do you want to make? What do you want to build? What do what can you can do it sort of, this sort of mentality that who'd go out and have an idea and follow through with it. Now, there's an interesting phase, I think, like the sort of early 2010s when this whole, I mean, it happened obviously much earlier, but when it really hit its strides of this startup world and the tech and the angel investment and stuff like that. And I think what drives me the most and what I've learnt the most is that anyone can kind of come up with a good idea, but you need to have an ability to go through with it. Now, that's not questioning individuals' abilities. It's just that, I had a friend come to me with an app idea years ago, and I'm like, it's a great idea, but do you know any app developers? Like, do you know, I don't. Have you worked in this area before? Like, what's your advantage? Your idea is good, but what is your advantage in this space? I mean, and that's not to say you can't do it, but I think that's led to a refinement of like, what's a good idea where I can be good at it, and what's a good idea where I believe I've got something that is harder for other people to offer. It doesn't need to be 100 out of 100, but it's sort of something where you're like, okay, how can you offer something that other people generally can't, and how do you develop something that your competitors will look at and go, oh, we should have done it like that. And and it's sort of maneuverability. So that sort of like, it's a rational ideation, if that makes sense. And it's
What,
a
what Yeah, what
yes, sorry.
drives it? Your the problem? Do you see the problem first, or do you see an opportunity? Are you out there looking for an opportunity, or is it always driven by a problem that you notice?
It's driven by wanting to make the thing. Like, it's driven by wanting it to, you can stand in front of it and go, it's there, it's real, it exists. And you've made an impact in some way. So I think I worked in my early career, I worked in the design industry, and in like advertising. And I was living in New York for a few years working in that space, like TV commercials and interactive web app developments and all this sort of stuff. And my big beef with the creative industry is that there was so much reliance on it's a great creative concept, but it will never exist. And that was enough for people in the creative industry quite a bit, and I get frustrated. I'm like, what's the point in making ideas that don't exist? I can't be satisfied with, oh, it was just, that's a good idea. You know, and like you've solved this creative problem, but you haven't solved a practical problem. And it's a bit insular in its thinking, and I've kind of got a bit frustrated at that. So I was drawn to the creative industry because it's a place for ideas, but sometimes it you know, that again, not to make too many enemies, but it's like quite often you're there and you're talking to the client, and the people in the other people in the creative business, like, the client's an idiot, and like the client's running a business and paying us to help them. Like, if they're an idiot, we're not, like, you know, that's a bit rough to say, but you know, like, it's just sort of like, I remember being on a pitch with a director of an agency, and he was calling the client an idiot, and that client's a billionaire. And I was like, he just doesn't care about the things that you think are the essential components of this, and we're wrong if we think that he has to. We've got to make it worth. We've got to make him understand it. So anyway, that's getting down the track. But
I think
it's
you
about
described the difference between an innovator and an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the one that takes it to market and understands the practicalities of an idea. One,
yes,
you get a good idea, but take the right one to market. So
the boring part, the hard part.
And the satisfaction, that is just so important, to have that determination and passion to get through all this planning and research and taking it to market. It certainly is a hard slog, and well done you on following through on some of these ideas. So what would you say to someone starting out? You know, what's your best advice if you cast your mind back perhaps to some of the wrong paths you've taken in your entrepreneurial journey? What's your best advice you give to someone starting out now?
Like, focus on, like, I think too often I've worked in entrepreneurial companies, and they are like, they just go and see, they've like, look at what this person's doing and do that. Now, I did product development for a company a while back, and they would do that. They would come in and go, here's a good product in market, let's do this, let's make it purple. And I think you've got to be careful of what you assume is right in what you're making, because sometimes you'll import problems as well as solutions, and focus on what you are and what your skills are can do something in a way that maybe someone else hasn't thought of before. Stop obsessing on who else's product you want it to be like. To kind of digress, but it is a regional Victoria thing. I was born and raised in Geelong, like, and I'm very sort of passionate about it. And my work down there in doing commercial property development was always about how do we make this so, like, play to the benefits of what Geelong offers rather than trying to mimic what Melbourne does. So it's like playing to your strengths, and using your weakness as an advantage, and using, you know, like we did commercial property developments that places in Melbourne can't do, right? Rather than us trying to mimic what they do and make a small Geelong version of it. And this is very relevant to regional Victoria. And that's what I thought with this project, where I'm like, regional accommodation, I feel like it's just importing Melbourne or capital city ideas into regional spaces, and capital city solutions into regional spaces. And it's not right. Like, how do you make something that's so good in regional Victoria? A capital city is like, we can't do that. That's better than what we've got, you know? And it's like, there's a mentality in regional areas that it's like, you know, there's this massive discrepancy between population of capital cities and regional areas in Australia you don't find in most other countries. And it's like, we've got these amazing natural, like, opportunities and regional opportunities, And I think it's stuck sometimes behind this headspace of like, well, they're just kind of little old regional Victoria. And it's, I feel like in the last couple of years, people are starting to kind of go, oh, like the winery scene, I think is huge. It's like, okay, like if I'm going out on the weekend, I'm like, I like going to that rather than going to a great inner city restaurant, like it's sort of, so there is food that's doing a better job of food than in the capital cities. So it's like, how do you play to that strength and do something that's like Bendigo in a way that Ballarat or Geelong or wherever else can't do it, and how does that, if it's global or whatever, I think that's sort of like, where are you and how does it work in a way that maybe is you're using those weaknesses as a strength. And I don't think regional is a weakness personally, but I think some people do. And you're yeah. Does that help answer the question in a roundabout way?
No, there was some good advice there. And yeah, absolutely. Startup Central Victoria is very much about playing up the strengths of the region and maximising them. And certainly agri-food, tourism, all of these
it's
strong
huge.
synergies here. So thank you, Andrew, for just sharing your thoughts and letting me throw these questions at you, and also explaining what Pavilla is all about. We wish you all the best. It's great to see the methodology that you've used to get to this point, and we look forward to lots of success for you in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Kerry, and I love the questions. I love the questions have been great, and it's real. I love robust discussion about these things because that's what helps make them real. I really appreciate your time and the time of Startup Victoria for this opportunity, and hopefully we'll be having some more conversations soon.